Hey guys, welcome back to Module 18. So I'm going to recap a little bit about the complexity of nature and then finish the lecture. And after that, I'll have you guys work on an ed puzzle, and that will be classwork. And then I will see you during the Zoom. And so we spoke in class already about the complexity of nature and how there's a hierarchy. It starts with organelles, and organelles that work together create cells. Cells work together to create tissue, so on and so on. And so environmental science, instead of starting at such a micro level, we start at the organism. And we study organisms and populations and communities and ecosystems. And so today in our class, we're going to talk about how we study populations. How is that different from in the way that it looks from studying communities and ecosystems? And so the study of populations, these are the studies of individuals that belong to the same species that live in a given area. So for example, all of the white-tailed deer in New England, or all of the aspen trees in Colorado. It's difficult to get numbers, but it's important to understand the interplay of different species, and that is one reason why we have to know populations to sort of keep a relative understanding. Has the number of species gone up? Have the number of individuals increased? Have the number of individuals decreased? What are the factors that are causing the increases and the decreases? When we study populations at a community level, we're studying how those individual populations interact. So remember that the definition of a community is different populations interacting. And so here, once again, communities contain multiple populations and exist within an ecosystem. So scientists have to observe how populations interact. So we need to understand what type of, which populations are increasing because they might be a food source. So the infamous hare and lynx graph, which I should have posted right here, is a great example of how two species will interact. When the hare population increases, well, then the food for the lynx increases, and so therefore the lynx population will increase. And then when they eat all the rabbits or the hare population decreases, and then the lynx starve because they've depleted their resources of food, and so the population of lynx goes down. And so you can see that interplay of different populations, and that is a community. Studying populations at an ecosystem level. So this now is incorporating a community, but now we're also incorporating abiotic factors or non-living factors. So it's important to include things like temperature, humidity, pH. How does the numbers of trees in a forested area impact the amount of CO2 being taken in? That is an ecosystem level question. We also look at the energy flow when we're studying ecosystems. So here we know that all of our energy comes from the sun. Producers are going to photosynthesize, and all of the energy in an ecosystem starts right here at the base with our producers. So this here looks like an aquatic ecosystem. And so then our primary consumers are going to eat those producers. And we know that 10% of that energy is lost every time something eats something. So here, as the energy flows up to the top of the pyramid, energy is lost at every step. And so we are taking into account this understanding of energy flow when we study ecosystems. And so populations have characteristics. They're changing, they're dynamic. They are going to, organisms are going to immigrate or emigrate. So that means they're going to come into an area or they're going to leave an area. And sometimes these have problems. Sometimes if the numbers of species gets too low, we studied bottlenecking. If that number of species gets too low, then the genetic diversity starts to decrease, and that becomes problematic. And so something where the invasion, so if something immigrates into an area that is not healthy for it, we call those um, an invasive organism, or it's just an exotic when it first enters an ecosystem. And if it then becomes problematic because it's so successful, if it outcompetes the native species, then it becomes an invasive species. And so one example of an invasive species is the emerald ash borer, which is actually pretty beautiful, but it is the immigration of this um, emerald ash borer into our ecosystems, our forested areas, are now devastating the ash tree populations. And one way that we study populations are these age structure diagrams that you see here. So this shows on this age structure diagram, we can see that, we can see that it's broken up by males and females, and that it is by age. So this is the number of individuals ages 0 to 4, the number of individuals ages 5 to 9, the number of individuals 10 to 14, and so on and so on. In the United States, the year 2018. This has a big role in understanding economy and what to expect. So we'll talk more about this later on, but if these numbers start to decrease, if the numbers of new people coming into a country or being born, if that number goes down, that has an impact. If that number increases dramatically, that's going to have an impact, especially as they get to these earning and spending years. They're going to have a great impact on the economy. And so when we are studying populations, we characterize or we identify the size of the population with the letter N. And we will be using some equations to study populations in the next module or two. But so let's keep in mind that the population size is N. And so that's the total number of individuals within a defined area at a given time. And so remember we said that it is the number of individuals per unit area. And we're going to start looking at these mosquitoes because the Edpuzzle at the end of the notes is going to talk about mosquitoes. And so it is important to understand where and when populations might boom or bust, when they'll grow or decrease. And we might not think that mosquitoes are important to understand when their populations are going to grow and when they're going to decrease. However, it's surprising because everything impacts everything else, as you will see. So where do you build your house? Do you build it by stagnant water? What time of year do you go to visit a country that might have mosquitoes that carry malaria? And so factors that are going to impact the size of a population. We have both density-dependent and density-independent factors. Density-dependent factors are factors that incorporate or include, that take into consideration the size of the population. And so if the size of the population increases, that's going to have effects. For example, we are living in the world of COVID-19 right now. That's an illness that is spreading. It's spreading so quick in highly populated areas. Why is that? Because we live very closely to one another. If you look at the regions where the disease is most abundant, it's all along the coastal areas of the United States. We're trying to keep it from moving towards the middle, which it's almost non-existent in the middle of the United States because people live further from one another. So this truly at this moment is at 10:30 on March 19th, it is truly just a coastal disease in the United States because of the size of the population. And so that was just a little aside. But there was a Russian scientist, Georgy Gauss, who conducted an experiment with two populations of paramecium. And what he did is he essentially found that food is the limiting factor to growth, that populations are going to grow. They're going to grow exponentially. If they have everything that they need, then they're going to grow exponentially. Meaning if they have enough space, if they have enough food, if they have enough everything, that they're going to grow exponentially. And then what he found is that, so it's going to grow exponentially, meaning that the population is going to double as long as there's enough food. But then what he found is that there was a limiting factor, and that the limiting factor was food. When the paramecium ran out of food because their populations grew and grew and grew, and then they ate all of their food, they were competing with one another. And so therefore there was a limiting factor. Because there was so many paramecium in a defined area, they ran out of something. And in this case it was food. Food was the limiting factor. And so what he derived was that this sort of model here is that populations are going to grow. If they have everything that they need, they're going to grow exponentially. 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, until they reach sort of it's called carrying capacity, when there is a limiting factor. In the example of the paramecium, it was food. So every ecosystem has a carrying capacity. Earth has a carrying capacity. It's debated whether it's at 10 billion, if it's at 8 billion or 9 billion. Different environmental scientists have different ideas about this. But there is an carrying capacity. So there's going to be a point where we can't make more food or enough food to feed everybody. And so this is what happens is your population grows exponentially, which we have seen that the human population is growing exponentially. But then it reaches this carrying capacity, or K. And it goes, and it doesn't just level off perfectly. It reaches this sort of homeostasis where the population is going to usually have a sharp drop off because of something happens, because of famine or something goes on. And then because the population went back down, it's going to rebound back up. And then it's going to become difficult again because resources are going to become limited. And then the population there will be die off. And so you'll see this sort of homeostasis, or this up and down of a population. And so this is called logistical growth. This whole thing right here is called logistical growth. This is exponential growth here, which is what happens when a population has everything that it needs. And then when it reaches carrying capacity, it's going to stabilize. And so this could be space, this could be food, this could be any number of things. And so therefore we call this logistical growth. So some examples, we talked about density. We talked about density dependent factors, so like food, space, disease. Those are all density dependent factors. Let's talk about some things that are going to change the size or alter the size of a population that are density independent. They don't have to do with the size of the population. And so these are going to be random events. So examples like tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions. These things are going to affect the size of a population, but it doesn't have to do with the size of the population. Again, if you have a wading bird like a heron, this heron can starve if a pond freezes, if the weather changes and the water gets cold and they weren't ready for it. Then the amphibians and fish are inaccessible. And so this is not a density-dependent factor. This is an independent factor. So an example, going back to our mosquitoes, is populations will decrease if there is no standing water to lay eggs. And so we're going to talk about the Texas mosquito mystery and West Nile virus. In 2012, there was an outbreak of the West Nile virus. And the virus can travel from mosquitoes to birds, and then from mosquitoes to humans and horses. And the numbers went up drastically in 2012. And so let's talk about why this happened in the